Standing Chair Parker. The first item on the agenda is Roman numeral 6. This is a matter that we decided to table and to bring forward to this committee per Commissioner Hardiman. I think he had some good points that he raised. I want to add a couple of commentaries, and I think one that he said was important, and that is we don't really know if the Trump administration, the White House, is going, more specifically HUD, I should say, HUD, will issue a CNI grant this year. I will say that I've had some conversations with our developer for Gilpin, and they have relationships with the Speaker of the House in Louisiana, and also some of these names may not be familiar to everybody, but Scalise, who's on the conservative, he runs the Republican caucus, and we're planning to have some conversations with the HUD secretary about, I am about Richmond per se, but more specifically about why the CNI is important, writ large, but more specifically for this project. We don't know what's going to happen, but I just wanted to let everyone know that we're planning to have meetings in Washington, D.C. with them. I also want to say that it's important to note that even if the HUD does not move with the CNI grant, it is our intention to seek out investors that will come to the table in partnership with RRHA, and not only the $50 million that would be this implementation grant, but a dollar amount that's greater than that, but in partnership with HUD. So we're not going to put all our marbles in one bag with the CNI grant. And so we're working, had conversations last week with a developer about looking at and identifying other investors, impact social investors and others who may come to the table. Again, as I said, $50 or even $50 million, but even greater than we anticipate for that. And so we're not going to rely. But to Commissioner Hardiman, again, as I said, raised some important points, and he asked to have legal counsel come forward and answer some of the I think good questions he raised, and he surely will probably, and others may have some others. And so we wanted to, I want to introduce counsel that we have brought forward today. He is Mike Syme. Mike is a partner and has been a longtime partner and for 2 decades experience in commercial and real estate law and corporate finance, with a particular emphasis on affordable housing and mixed finance development. He has worked extensively in low-income housing tax credit and choice neighborhoods and Hope 6 capital fund financing and RAD developments, representing several housing authorities across the country and finance, development, and affordable housing. He frequently counsels housing authorities in the creation of affiliated entities like the RDC. And so we are fortunate to have Mike be with us and to address some of the questions. I think he knows some that were raised, and then for him to be available in additional questions. Mike, if you can say a few words, please. Mike, you're still on mute.
Well, that's a shame. I'm sure I was eloquent. Nonetheless, I want to thank Mr. Nesmith for the nice introduction. I especially like the fact that you said I've been doing this for about 2 decades, because it's kind of over 3 now, but that just dates me more than I'd like to admit. And all I do is represent housing authorities. We decided a long time ago not to represent developers in this area. But I did take a good look at the suggestion that came of having Gilpin Court transferred from the Housing Authority to the Richmond Development Corporation. Quite frankly, I thought the idea was brilliant, and it was not my idea, but I like it a lot. The Richmond Development Corporation is an instrumentality of the authority. The authority controls RDC through the board. So if Gilpin is transferred to RDC, the the authority doesn't really lose control. It simply means it's moved to what's called an instrumentality. HUD has to provide the disposition, and in order to get HUD to approve that disposition, we would be taking the approach that we have documentation that shows that Gilpin is functionally obsolete. More importantly, at least as HUD is functioning today, that would entitle Gilpin to receive something called tenant protection vouchers. These are Section 8 vouchers that are used to supplement the resident's rent. So the resident will not be affected at all. They will not pay any more in rent than they do today. And the authority will not lose money because the authority will be getting payments through the Section 8 program rather than through the current public housing program. More importantly, we can use those vouchers as leverage for redevelopment. If Choice Neighborhoods is awarded, we still have those vouchers to help leverage the development and bring in more money for the overall revitalization. If Choice Neighborhoods goes away, the tax credit program looks to be remaining, and we would still be going forward and getting low-income housing tax credits, and we would be able to use those tenant protection vouchers to provide additional subsidy and leverage them for debt and help recreate Gilpin. And as I said, the authority through all of this does not lose control. You'll still be in control through your ownership of RDC. And the Section 8 program is a better protected and better funded program than public housing. The Section 8 program gets funded and is protected in part because private investors own buildings that receive Section 8 subsidy, and they can do something you're not allowed to do, and that's petition Congress and lobby. More importantly, the budget that is currently being bounced around through the Trump administration actually shows an increase in Section 8. Not a huge increase, but an increase nonetheless. So this idea, to me, when I read it, I thought was brilliant. I liked the way it was structured. The only thing that would have given me pause was if RDC wasn't your instrumentality, but it is. I don't really see much of a downside for the authority, but I see a lot of upside. So I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. Are there any questions, follow-up questions to what Mike has shared with us so far, particularly Mr. Hardiman? Do you have anything? You have a mic?
Mr. Chair, I wanted to ask a question, and
Please.
I think this is for the CEO. We spoke about oversight, so I understand our RDC being an instrumentality of the authority, but it has a separate board, a board which, per our last board meeting, would be comprised of, I think, 5 individuals, or one of whom would only one of whom would be a board member of RRHA.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen any bylaws from the RDC, so I don't know what their board's authority is. So my question is, once control of the property, if it's relinquished to RDC, what role does the RHA board still have in any oversight of Gilpin at that point?
Sure. Great question. So a couple of things. First is that if you recall in the resolution that this board, full board, passed recently, the RDC board, any actions that they vote on would have to be voted on by the full RRHA board. So again, not only in terms of the RDC being the instrumentality of RRHA, and therefore RRHA still control of it. Again, there was specific language. Whatever it votes on, it brings that vote to the RRHA full board. And so again, that's almost like a stopgap, if you will, for whatever activities that the RDC board would engage in.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up question, if I may.
Yes, please, Mr. Jackson.
So, Stephen, and you're absolutely correct. There is a stopgap there, and we still have control over that, over those final decisions. But would the proper order be to come to the committee first and then get passed along to the full board, or what would the specifics of that procedure look like?
Sure. So, if the RDC is undertaking a real estate development transaction, yes, that would come to your committee as chair, right? If the RDC, which it is intending to generate unrestricted revenue for RRHA writ large, there are going to be activities that are not real estate related that we hope will generate revenue, and that initiative would not become before your as a germane matter. It would not be germane because it's not real estate. And so we'll be sharing with the full board a number of activities we'd like to undertake that would generate revenue. So yes, if there's the RDC is engaged in something that is real estate related, it would come first to your committee, yes.
Thank you. Let me ask you now, because you've opened up the non-real estate items, the oversight for those particular events. I don't know what they might be, but obviously, where does that oversight come into play? Or is that just chalked up as operations, and or how do we observe that?
I will look at the language again. I believe that the RDC board, whatever it votes on, that comes back to the RRHA board. So, for instance, let's talk. We talked today about 10 things, I think. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you that the board did vote. The RDC board did vote today. We met just as a perfunctory matter to codify what the RRHA board voted on. That is our new structure and activities. We also voted that George Martin will be general counsel to the RDC board, and he was on the board meeting today. But say, for instance, I'll give you one example. So one of the things that we're thinking about that's just an example, real estate, we want to see whether this is out of the box. The Baltimore Housing Authority is, if I get this wrong, who's going to speak to? Can you speak to this? What the Baltimore Housing is in terms of, yeah, can you just speak to that really quickly? What that is, and that's a non-real estate related type of activity that would not become for the real estate committee. We're trying to think out the box, and we'll be bringing these ideas to the full board to say, hey, what do you think about that?
Commissioners, as part of the brainstorming today, we revisited the what ifs, including using our rooftop space for renting to cellular telephone outlets and receiving sort of passive income on a regular basis. That would be something, just to repeat what the CEO said, if we were to do that, we would come back to the full board to codify that activity. But it's one of those things that is not specifically real estate. I guess you can call it real estate, but it's really one of those things that's a revenue generating exercise that will actually still have board review authority prior to any kind of execution.
Mike, you're saying you're going to use the rooftop for cellular?
Yeah, it's been used.
Okay.
Excuse me, Commissioner. It's been used in a lot of housing authorities.
It's being used right now in Baltimore.
Oh, Baltimore's doing it?
Yeah,
But
so
not solar units up there?
No, not solar.
Cell back,
No,
but
this is,
cellular.
we're working with like local cellular companies.
cell tower there.
Cell towers, exactly.
Yeah.
It's just one of the what ifs.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Is there more you have to say, Steve? And
I don't think more. I think you showed up the question, sir.
And okay, please. Mr. Jackson, are you complete with your questions there? Did you hear everything you needed to hear?
Yes, sir. That was excellent. Thank you. I appreciate the example also, which is an out of the box and not out of the norm type of passive investment. Thank you.
And also, Mr. Elliott, were you complete in what you asked previously? Did you get your answers?
I did. I do want to defer some time to Mr. Hardiman because I think he'll have some questions that'll answer some questions for me. I guess where I am is, I guess what I'm trying to understand is a clear breakdown of the benefits and potential costs or detrimental things that could occur by transfer of this transfer, and why this is a better option than keeping Gilpin under the auspices of RRHA.
I think it's a great question. We put that to council.
And I think, Mr. Stiles, maybe you might want to answer that if you can. I'm sure you can. Mike?
So there are a couple of reasons here. One reason is by doing this transfer now, it gives you an opportunity to avail yourself of tenant protection vouchers from HUD. They are currently permitted, and the budget currently would allow that. And we are concerned that the budget could change, and certainly the staffing levels at HUD could change and make that no longer available. But those are only available if there's a transfer. So long as Gilpin remains, those are the HUD rules. The HUD rules state that tenant protection vouchers can be awarded by HUD upon the transfer of the property to a, quote, third party. HUD does permit instrumentalities owned by the authority to be that third party. So we would be getting a subsidy that we are otherwise not able to collect. The other reason to do this is because in the event that we develop Gilpin and monies are paid that come into the Richmond Development Corporation, while HUD sees an instrumentality as one and the same, state law, which governs Richmond Development Corporation, means that those monies are one step removed from HUD's ability to, quote, recapture them. HUD takes a position frequently that even though you earned the money, if it gets mixed into your accounts, it's their money. And they do have the ability to, quote, recapture. That's the word they use. This protects you from that. Finally, as I said, you control this entity, and while there may only be one board member, the board members otherwise are your employees. And as the board, you still have the ability to direct your employees through the executive director. So that your executive director would be reporting back to you, and thus you have control. So like I said, I thought this was a really great idea. I don't know who came up with it, but whoever did, kudos to you.
Thank you.
What are there any potential pitfalls? I guess why isn't this just done with every single property then?
Because going through HUD and getting them to approve the dispo takes time and effort. And B, because it was something we could have done as we gotten closer to development for any other deal until the new administration made it clear they're not supporting this. And if the rumors are true and the memos we've seen leaked are true, HUD is going to lose up to 50% of its employees. Doing this after that will make it much, much more difficult, as a lot of the people that they're going to lose are the people that know how to get the job done.
If I could, Mr. Chair.
Please.
But also Commissioner Hardiman raised an issue. I'm sorry if I'm stealing your thunder, Commissioner Hardiman. So then therefore, why did not we do it with Creighton? We got to make that distinction. And I think that you had that, Jeff Lyons. I believe you're on mute, but
yeah, I just took myself off. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Mike doesn't know the specifics of Creighton, but I think that was a good question by Commissioner Hardiman last time.
So I will give you two reasons. One is Gilpin will meet the terms of obsolescence. So when you do disposition based on obsolescence, you qualify for tenant protection vouchers. There's some other ways you can do it, but this is the primary way. So that was one thing in terms of Gilpin. We had a 2022 physical needs assessment. We're updating that, but the 2022 needs assessment showed that Gilpin meets physical obsolescence, and therefore a disposition based on physical obsolescence will trigger the ability to request and receive tenant protection vouchers. With Creighton precedes me, and it's being done more on a phase-by-phase basis. And we're looking at Gilpin as an overall planned redevelopment under choice. So I think that makes it's easier to make this lift. But there's no reason why it couldn't have been done for Creighton earlier. But it's not the path. And I also think that Creighton was initiated before there have been also changes at HUD, which have made it more significant of an opportunity than would have been otherwise.
I have no more questions. I think we should defer to
Okay.
Chairman Hardiman.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sure.
Steve, did you have something further?
No, I'm sorry, time to
Okay.
Hardiman.
Thank you. First, thank you for doing this and putting it together. I appreciate it because I do have a lot of questions. But first, if you'll indulge me, I'd just kind of like to state the world as I know it when it comes to the disposition process. So with what we did with my recollection from Creighton is we did a demolition disposition request from HUD to turn it over to the community builders. Now, what I don't remember is if we did all of Creighton or just phase one of Creighton. I think we just did phase one of Creighton, and I did go on the Richmond property records to look at Creighton today, and there's a portion owned by the community builders, and it looks like phase two is still owned by RRHA.
Mhm.
So when you have to put in a disposition or demolition, you have to make that request under RAD or under Section 18, I believe. There are the two programs that we're utilizing for redevelopment, regardless of who the property is going to. So that demo dispo is required if it's going to RDC, if it's going to a private developer like it is that the community builders had in Creighton. In order to submit and have approved that request, you have to have a tenant relocation plan in place. They require that as part of this. So we would need to have a tenant relocation plan ready to go. And then the tenant protection vouchers are highly valuable to tenants themselves because they don't have any residency restrictions on them. So essentially you can port them immediately. You don't have to wait the year with a housing choice voucher that you would normally have to wait to port that voucher. The housing authority does have the ability to turn those tenant protection vouchers into project-based vouchers. But that means that voucher no longer attaches to the tenant, it attaches to the unit. And the tenant has first right of refusal on that unit once it's built to return. So my personal feeling on that is without having a relocation plan in place, and I know we've done some assessment with the tenants in Gilpin already as to what their preferences are. I'm not sure what those preferences have been stated were, but I mean, with Creighton phase one, we had like over 70% of people wanted to leave and take the tenant protection vouchers. And I'm assuming that Gilpin will be similar. So all of that has to be in place. That's how you how you transition the tenant protection voucher into a project-based voucher, which would help with funding for redevelopment. What I don't know is the timeline for all of this. So what is the timeline for submission? Oh, one other thing. When you submit the Section 18 request, HUD tells you to stop leasing. So, and we ran into this problem with Creighton too, because we submitted the demo dispo application. HUD said, stop leasing. And there are two problems with that. One, we have extensive wait lists of people trying to get into public housing who can't get into public housing because we had to stop leasing. Two, those vacancies count against us, which means that we get less money to manage Gilpin while the disposition is taking place. So while the adjudication of the disposition is taking place. So again, sorry, back to my question. What's the timeline of all of this happening? Because we can't transfer Gilpin to RDC until the disposition is approved by HUD, which last time that was a 2-year process. So what is our timeline?
So I'm happy to try and answer that, Stephen, if you'd like.
Yes.
So let's take it from the top. So Creighton was a demo dispo. So Creighton already was asking for approval to demolish the buildings. We're not asking for approval to demolish the buildings. We're doing a disposition based on obsolescence. So the first thing is that we can apply for tenant protection vouchers. But you are correct, we can't really take them until we're ready to use them. And the first thing is, if you do a RAD disposition, you don't qualify for tenant protection vouchers. So you can do, based on the amount of work you're going to do, a RAD PBV blend and get project-based financing for RAD, but you do not. So in other words, by following the Section 18, you get vouchers in hand, but you get the authorization for vouchers. We don't necessarily get access to the vouchers till we're ready to use them. And so we would have to provide a relocation plan and a phase-by-phase development. But the notion would be to lock them in the meantime. HUD will not tell us not to rent the units unless we've taken the vouchers. So until we take vouchers for any particular phase, we're not required to vacate the units. We can continue to operate it as public housing.
But so that doesn't answer the question about timeline. So the question is,
well, we don't have, so sir, we have a 750 unit development here, and we don't have a choice grant. And as Mr. Nesmith said, if we don't get a choice grant, we're going to go out and try and raise private equity. So that's finance. So financing an opportunity will dictate the timeline as opposed to process. So the process will follow the financing and opportunity. If once we get a choice neighborhood grant, we would have, obviously in our grant application, we would have a timeline, and then we would codify that in the finalization of the submission of the housing component of choice. It's got a housing and people component. The housing component would finalize that, and HUD would approve that, and then we would have a timeline. If we don't get a choice grant, then we will, through pursuit of private equity and other investment, come up with a timeline on a phase-by-phase basis. So the answer to the question is driven by funding and opportunity, and not by an answer I can give you today.
But let's think about a hypothetical, okay, if I may, Mr. Chair.
well,
Please.
Yeah, I think when he's, how about a hypothetical? Let's say we were to get it. Walk us through what a timeline, if I think I'm getting what Chairman Hardiman, Chairman, I keep thinking about his phone chair. Commissioner Hardiman was asking us, what would the timeline be for a number of the things that he raised? You said we would not have to stop leasing and the
Right.
vacancies, and with that, I think you said would not count against. What would and maybe that might help him to walk through what a hypothetical timeline might be, and what are those milestone things that we would need to do?
Well, the size of the Gilpin footprint is very large, and right now it constitutes about 10 phases. So on a phase-by-phase basis, unless we do phases simultaneously, they would roughly require 24 to 36 months to complete. I assume we would do some simultaneously, so it would be a period of several years, unless we made a conscious decision to do significant demolition and level the sites prior to developing on the phases. So I've got two choice neighborhood clients right now. Syracuse is roughly a 12-year time horizon on the redevelopment of what's called the East Adams area around University of Syracuse. And Fort Myers is a smaller one, and it's about 7 years in terms of its development around what's called the Cleveland Avenue area of Fort Myers. So, and Dunbar. So those are the, I think, two current in-process timelines that you could expect, probably something closer to Syracuse, because that would have the larger mass of units and redevelopment footprint.
okay, let me clarify what I'm not asking for timeline.
Mm-hmm.
We have been asked as a board to approve a resolution to transfer Gilpin to the RDC. In order for that to happen, in order for the transfer to happen, and under my understanding, is that HUD would have to approve our disposition request.
Correct.
question is, and then in order to get the tenant protection vouchers, we would have to be authorized by HUD. So two questions in timeline here. Where are we on a disposition request to HUD? Has it even been contemplated yet? Do we have any of the elements that need to go into that disposition request? And at what point in that disposition process are we granted the tenant protection vouchers? Are they verified? Because what I read in the regulation didn't say anything about the TPVs. It just said, once you submit the application, HUD will tell you to stop renting.
Those are good points. Sherill, would you like to, from a city perspective, add some color to this very specific questions that Commissioner Hardiman is asking? Sherill, you're on mute if you're trying to speak.
You're asking me?
Sherill,
Oh,
Yes, sir.
did you hear?
I did not. If you could repeat the question, please.
Sure. So the thing that precipitated all of this is we were asking to approve the transfer of Gilpin to RDC. In order for that transfer to happen, HUD has to approve a disposition request from RRHA. Where
Yes.
are we in the creation of that disposition request? What is the timeline for that? What are the elements that we have prepared for that disposition? And then at what point are we awarded the tenant protection vouchers? Because again, what I read in the regulations was, and what I recall from Creighton was, as soon as we submitted that application, we had to stop renting those units. And just to be frank, we submitted the application and it took a very long time because HUD doesn't like us, and they kept putting our application at the bottom of the pile.
Yes, there are a couple of things, and Jeff, please chime in on your most recent use of this tool. However, the application will take probably 6 months, 4 to 6 months to approve, somewhere in that thing. And as HUD continues to cut staff, that time could lengthen. Demolition, normally they approve demolition and the total tenant protection vouchers you will receive. We submit that and we get that approval. We work with all residents to tee them up as to what their rights are, and how we will be moving forward with that engagement with them so that they will understand relocation. But Jeff, from your use of this tool in another project, how did you do it? Because we would be two questions. One that Commissioner Hardiman asked, do we have to stop leasing apartments if we make this disposition? If that's what I heard him ask, if that's correct, I'll let you answer that first.
There should be nothing that prohibits us from leasing apartments until we're ready to execute on individual phases on the property.
Can I
In other
answer a
words,
quick
HUD's
question?
not- yeah.
Answer a quick question. So, do you know why then under Creighton, Commissioner Hardiman said we were asked to do it? Can you draw that distinction? Because
Well,
we were, he said, under Creighton.
What I will speculate is that you submitted the demolition application with a specific schedule, and therefore you had a relocation schedule that called for the delivery of the vouchers as you began to demolish, as you prepared to demolish the units. As is the case in many cases, relocation schedules aren't always met. So it may have been that because you had already triggered phase down subsidy and your relocation plan was already in place, that there was an issue of renting units because they'd already been taken offline and you've been given the vouchers to replace those units. You don't take vouchers to replace units until you're ready. You can continue to lease them and operate them. I don't know how the work was phased and sequenced at Creighton, but my experience is I have had housing authorities who have taken the vouchers and then all of a sudden they have to trigger phase down, they lose the subsidy, and those units are no longer subsidized, and therefore they can't be leased. because there's no subsidy to support them to a low-income housing tenant.
So that's going to
In
lead me into
addition
another.
to that, the schedule for that redevelopment was expedited by the developer because they had already applied and received the 9% tax credit. So it was an impetus, as Jeff said, to move forward and do the demolition simultaneously since they had approval. So,
Okay,
and I think there was a second question, Commissioner Hardiman.
well, so there's no timeline for disposition at this point. We don't have anything. I mean, let me just ask it that way without the timeline question. Do we have anything prepared to submit to HUD for disposition at this point?
Sherill?
Do we have, if he could repeat it or you could repeat it?
Have we put together any of the elements that are required for a disposition request from HUD?
I would say that we are in the preliminary stages for a disposition. That's not demolition yet, that's disposition. And I would say early preliminary stages.
Mr. Hardiman,
So-
can I just ask one
Yeah,
question?
yeah.
Sorry. Is the disposition of Gilpin a prerequisite to filing the disposition application with HUD and for the application for the tenant protection vouchers? Does this need to occur first before that occurs?
No,
I'm
go ahead,
sorry,
Jeff.
go ahead, Cheryl. Yeah, no,
No,
okay,
go
so,
ahead, Jeff.
okay, so you submit the disposition application, and then you can request, once it's approved, the tenant protection vouchers. So the disposition application gets approved, and then you submit the request for the TPVs. In fact, that can happen almost simultaneously with the same day it's approved.
Right, but my question is with respect to the resolution, what we're being asked to do is approve a resolution to transfer the property, the Gilpin, to the RDC. Does that have to occur before the disposition application is submitted to HUD?
Yes, it does. You require
HUD's
board
gonna
approval.
want to see that
Yeah.
you've approved this in order to even consider the dispo application.
Okay, so moving on from that, is the objective to continue operating Gilpin as rental housing after it is transferred to the RDC prior to redevelopment starting?
Great question. Great question. I know the
Well, I
answer, but I'm not
expect
going
for
to
some
answer.
period of time, it will be operated as public housing while we mobilize either under a choice grant or under an alternative to proceed with phased redevelopment.
Would it at
That's a
any
point- hang
time
on one
stop though?
second.
Yeah,
Hang on one second.
yeah.
Because that's a point that I want to make sure is clear. It won't be operated as public housing. Once it is transferred to RDC, it is private housing with a federal subsidy that is receiving either a project-based federal subsidy, which it won't be because we're not doing any renovations to it, but the federal subsidy will be coming through the tenants, through the tenant protection vouchers and any other housing choice voucher holders who live there. We will not be paid in the same way for Gilpin once it is transferred that we are paid now. So operations will fall, the cost of operations will fall solely on the housing authority. And if all of those tenants who have tenant protection vouchers after whatever period of time say, sorry, we're out, we're going to have to attract the RDC is going to have to attract other tenants to Gilpin as a private development, which is not subsidized.
And just to follow up on that,
That's an interesting
but
question.
can people be pulled off of the wait list for those vacancies though?
That's a
Michael, do
great-
you want to answer that question?
That's a great question, I'm gonna be honest.
Well,
And then you follow up with
Michael.
Commissioner Elliott.
correct. It will not be a public housing development.
Hold on one second, Mike. Commissioner Harm, he's gonna answer. your
Sorry,
question.
go ahead.
But that's a great question. Go ahead.
It will not be a public housing development anymore. It will be de facto a private development. However, it will be operating, taking in residents with Section 8 vouchers. And that would include not just those receiving the tenant protection vouchers, but any other voucher holder in the authority's portfolio. And you would be managing it through your multifamily program and your Section 8 program. Now I'll ask a question. Do you have a Section 8 waiting list?
Yes. Yes.
And do you have trouble getting landlords to accept those vouchers?
I'll let the Senior Vice President for Public Housing answer that question.
We have a 60% success rate with landlords accepting our vouchers.
Okay, well, if Gilpin is there and you find yourselves in a position where people with the tenant protection vouchers don't want to stay, you become the landlord that accepts virtually 100%. And I know in a lot of housing authorities, they do this just to get their Section 8 numbers up and fully utilized. Because we do have problems with landlords not wanting to accept people with Section 8 vouchers.
But sir, there just as a point of clarification on our ACV program side, our utilization is about at 85%. Our budget authority of what we're expending, I think we're expending about 105% and maybe like 98% of just our budget authority, and held reserves is 95, 115 of just our budget authority. So with us taking 100% of the vouchers and kind of what we do on other avenues, what happens if we can't accept more of those vouchers?
So, Michael, I want to add one more thing. So, in other words, we don't have to execute the disposition until we are ready. So we get HUD's disposition approval. And if we aren't ready to proceed with it, we can, first of all, we can dispose of it by phase, or we can dispose of the entire property. But until we do, we continue to receive public housing subsidy.
Okay, so I have another question, a couple more
Yeah.
questions. So if the transfer happens and we're taking vouchers, there are two things that also come with that. The first one is real estate taxes. Currently, RRHA does not pay real estate taxes on public housing because we are a government agency. RDC is not a government agency. I talked to the city about this today. Altria transferred a building to the school board a few years ago without telling the city they were doing it. And they had to go through a lot of machinations to not have to pay real estate taxes because the Constitution requires it. So we will owe real estate taxes on Gilpin if it is transferred to the RDC. Second, in addition to our property management budget that we receive money for Gilpin to subsidize rents, we have a capital budget, which is separate and apart from the money that comes in for managing the properties. That money will not come to Gilpin anymore. Gilpin will not be eligible for that money anymore. Gilpin is functionally obsolescent and it will need upgrades and constant maintenance, including the boilers that heat them. And we can't go back to HUD and get them to fund that maintenance separately.
Ooh, those are, I say ooh to those two questions, but someone needs to answer it, particularly on the second one, because we're about to have a discussion on capital. I know that that's a very technical question. Mike?
I'm not sure I follow how that question was phrased, but I think Jeff answered it, which was we're not going to do this till we're ready. So we may do this disposition and get approval from HUD and do it in phases as we're ready to revitalize a particular phase or phases so that we know we're getting the tenant protection vouchers and we're not leasing up, but at the same time, we're going forward and revitalizing. So the residents will know what we're doing and the money is already there, whether it's through the choice neighborhood, the tax credits, or other funds. But we're not going to go in an order that leaves you with a derelict property that can't be replaced because we decided to dispose of it too soon.
Okay, so this is going to be my last point. So the disposition application does require you to have a plan to upgrade the properties. Like you can't, HUD won't let you dispose of it unless you have a plan in place to upgrade the properties. And we don't have that plan right now.
Well, we have actually a choice neighborhoods plan, sir.
Can I not be interrupted?
Yeah, let him
sorry,
finish his question.
Excuse me.
So
my apologies.
We don't have that plan right now. And we don't have a disposition ready to go with any of the pieces and parts built for that disposition. We don't really know all of the ramifications for disposing of Gilpin to the RDC when we have that ready. And I am going to argue that the authority does not have control of the RDC. And I know we're working with Stephen, we're working with the staff that's here right now, and you guys are great, but that doesn't mean you're going to be here when that disposition happens. And it doesn't mean that the next people who are in these jobs are going to agree that this board has control of the RDC, other than to hire and fire the CEO and other than to dissolve the RDC itself, which if you dissolve the RDC, it is an entity that owns property and you're going to have to unwind all of that. I also have a problem that George is the general counsel for RRHA and the RDC because there needs to be arm's length transactions that are happening there. There's also going to have to be a property management agreement that works with the staff at RRHA and the entity of RDC. So we need to have two attorneys who are working separately for those two things. All of that being said, what Kyle said earlier was right. We do have to have this resolution passed before this goes in, because HUD is going to want to see that the board has blessed this. Because we don't know how any of this is going to happen. We don't know the real ramifications of all of this. We don't have any piece of this disposition really built yet. I cannot, in good faith, vote in favor of transferring the Gilpin, which is our biggest property, and really central to our city. I mean, we did, and quite honestly, I mean, we will probably have to transfer it to the other developer eventually too. So there will be a second transfer of this property. But we're not there yet. And I'm not ready to say as a board, yeah, let's do this, because we don't even know what the pieces of the puzzle are yet. So I do think eventually transferring Gilpin to the RDC is probably the right thing to do. I'm not convinced that it is now. And I am not convinced that we are anywhere close to being prepared to do that. That's all I'll say.
Steve, what would you recommend here as we go forward?
Well, I
think Mr. Hardiman has some very good
think
points.
There are some questions that he's raised that we've got to run down.
Yeah.
Namely, one, because we did talk about this when we were talking with an investor called Ascenda. Ascenda wanted to partner as a private investor. They wanted to potentially partner with RRHA and acquire or buildings. And then we would have some financial remuneration and we would share that. But one of the big reasons why they wanted to enter into that partnership is because whatever we would acquire, and if it would sit for whatever amount of years, call it 99 years, under the RRHA, it would not be subject to real estate tax. So that is one question I think we have to run the ground. And so so that's one. Two, we also have to run the ground around the issue around whether or not, if it is transferred into RDC, whether or not, as Hardiman has asked, and I don't know the answer to it, it will have an impact, Mike Kelly, as you're working really hard on the capital fund, if it's going to not be eligible, I'm not saying it's correct, for capital funding, that would be horrible. Because so that's the second, I think, question that has to be run the ground. And then I think a couple others I think they're probably easy answered. So don't hate me for this.
We're not.
I just think that this has been a very good discussion. And as CEO, I have to be very thoughtful about these things. And I think that we should come back at this.
Right.
Make a list of questions that we need to run to ground. I think Mike, you've been awesome. Jeff, you've been awesome. Obviously, Sherill comes to us with experience from the city, and she was there when Creighton Court did happen. But I think this good discussion has led us to some additional questions, I think important questions, particularly around the issue that that you were raising, Corey, and that was raised about, you know, our vouchers and what posture would that put us in if we would have to, the RDC would be responsible to trying to find those. That's another question I think we need just to drill down on a little bit more. And I would thus propose that, as Hardiman said, this is probably the right thing to do. But I think this intellectual conversation has led us to say, hey, let's take a pause and answer some more questions. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We have next month. So I just think we should, to be prudent as a CEO, that's what one of the things I'm paid to do. I think we should just table for a moment. We've got great questions that have been brought, and then we continue talking about it. But we need to run the ground some questions.
Okay, moving forward, let's. Were you going to say something, Kim? Oh, I'm sorry. Moving forward, then what we're going to do is we're going to table this particular item here because there were quite a few questions that were on the table, and I think as Mike Syme and Jeff Lyons have said that, you know, there's some opportunities to move forward with this thing, but we want to make sure when we do, we do it right, and that everybody's comfortable with how we're moving forward too. So we're going to table this for now. We can't push this towards the full board at this point, and we're going to ask our staff and Steve to come back with some answers to some of these questions, and then we'll entertain them again. So let's move to the next item on the agenda.
Next item, Mr. Chair, is the overview of the capital funds program, the 5-year needs for the big